Romans chapter 4 is where we're going to be at tonight. I am excited to get into Romans 4 with you guys this evening, and I hope that you're ready for it as well. I really appreciated Brother John's message last week as he went through the first half of Romans 4 for us, and I'm excited to kind of continue that on from verse number 13. As we've gone through the book of Romans, we are discovering the power of the gospel together. That is what Paul's theme is, especially in the very first part of Romans. He's really trying to unpack how the gospel changes everything for us, and really how the gospel is the true fulfillment of what God has been planning from the very beginning. God did not have to somehow, when mankind sinned, or somehow, when the New Testament came around, have to redirect his attention. He knew from the very beginning that the gospel, according to Jesus Christ, was exactly going to be his plan for redemption for mankind. It was always where all of his eggs were in that basket, so to speak, if I can use that statement. And so we're going to be taking a look at tonight this idea of justification by faith alone. Now, I've been trying to start out when I preach. I start out with the questions, and there's a couple reasons for that. If you do not have the little sheet with the questions on it, if you'll raise your hand, and some of the ushers will bring one to you real quick. There's a little just quarter sheet of paper with some questions on it, so you can follow along here. But I start out with the questions for two reasons. Number one, it helps me have a target to aim at. I find sometimes when I preach, I can easily go on rabbit trails where I'm finding other things to talk about that are exciting and within the scope of Scripture, but not the main point of my sermon. And so when I start with the questions, it reminds me of, hey, this is my target. But it also, I think, gives you guys an opportunity to know what to listen for. These questions are developed with what my goal for the sermon in mind is, and how I'm trying to open up these scripture verses and help us to understand them. And so I want you guys to hit that goal with me as we go through this together. And so this helps you to listen with educated ears, or intentional ears, if you will, is what my hope is. So the questions that we're going to be aiming to be able to answer tonight are as follows. Number one, according to Paul's argument in Romans, why is keeping the law never sufficient to provide us righteousness or God's blessings? The question number two, in what areas of your life do you feel the struggle between faith and sight? Maybe share an example where you trusted God in a situation that seemed humanly impossible and how it affected your faith. And then number three, like Abraham, we all have moments of doubt. Are there doubts that you are currently wrestling with that you would feel comfortable sharing with another Christian? And how can we as a church family support each other during these times of doubt? And so these are some of the targets that we're aiming at tonight as we go through this. Like I said, tonight's passage is, I've titled the sermon is Justification by Faith Alone. And that's not something original to me. I believe that's what Romans chapter 4 is entirely about. When I was preaching through the book of Romans for the young adults on Friday nights, and I did Romans 4, I actually did the whole chapter in one sermon, and for many reasons, including just length, we decided to split it up in half. But when I went through it, I was telling Brother John this morning, when I went through it, my points were faith not this, faith not rights, faith not law, faith not works, right? And that's where I really see the idea that Paul is laying out for us here in Romans chapter 4. But he's building towards a primary thought. And we find that thought that he's building towards is what he's going to be actually explaining in chapter 5. In Romans chapter 5, verse 1, Paul writes this, therefore, that key word that we look for whenever we're studying the Bible, we see the word therefore, we go, oh, everything I just said leads me to this thought. Therefore, based on Romans 4, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So this is the encapsulating truth that the Apostle Paul is leading us into through his writings here in Romans chapter 4. He says, because we are justified by faith, something happens in our life. So the question that we're seeking to answer is this. How does Abraham's historical significance to the Jews integrate into the salvation message that Paul is attempting to present? If you remember back last week, Brother John presented to us at the very end of the sermon, he talked a lot about Abraham, and Abraham is not just the father of the Jews, but Paul presents him as the father of all Christians spiritually, right? And he shows that contention that the Jews would have had with the Gentiles claiming Abraham as their father. Any Gentile could join the Jewish nation and participate in their cultures and customs, save one thing. They could not claim Abraham as their father. That was something that the Jews would not allow, is what Brother John explained to us last week. And so now we see Paul is saying, wait a second, no, Abraham is not just the father of the Jews by nature of his circumcision, but he's the father of all Christians by nature of his faith. And so Abraham, his historical significance, not just to the Jews, but really that significance integrates into this salvation message that Paul is trying to present to us. I love this quote from Douglas Moo. He says it this way: "It is Abraham's faith, not his works of obedience or his circumcision, that Paul thinks is vital in understanding Abraham's salvation historical significance." Like I said at the beginning, salvation through Jesus Christ has always been God's plan. It's not something that God, cooked up there last second as we transition into the New Testament. It was always God's plan. And so when we even see the story of Abraham is significant in the salvation historical narrative because of how he sets an example for faith, not for works. It is his faith in God that we look to as his example. You see, Abraham's circumcision makes him the historical father of the Jews. But Abraham's faith to righteousness makes him the spiritual father of all believers. And that's what Paul really is presenting the last couple verses of Romans 4 that we looked at last week, verses 11 and 10 and 11 and 12 and so forth. And so now we find ourselves in verse number 13. So let's start reading here, and we'll read 13 through 17 just to get started. The Bible says this: "For the promise that he would be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void, and the promise made of none effect, because the law worketh wrath. For where no law is, there is no transgression. Therefore it is of faith, that it might be by grace, to the end the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, I have made thee a father of many nations. Before him whom he believed, even God, who quickeneth the dead, and calleth those things which were not, which calleth those things which be not, as though they were." You see, we see here in this next section there that Paul says it's faith, not law. He's going to distinguish between these two items. The first thing we see in verse number 13 is that Abraham's spiritual descendants, quote unquote, are blessed through the righteousness of faith. Look at verse 13 with me again one more time. "For the promise that he should be the heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith." You see, we look at the Jews and we see their distinguishment as a distinct culture and nation, and that heritage that gets brought through that descendancy, right? We understand that because it's simple. We do the same thing. We can trace our heritage, our lineage. We can go back and look at where our ancestry comes from, or where our race, or not race is not the word I'm looking for, but cultural and ethnic background comes from, right? That's why things like 23andMe or Ancestry.com have become so popular. We like to know where we come from because we like that heritage. But Paul here is actually disconnecting from that descendancy from Abraham in that way. And he's reconnecting it to Abraham's faith and saying that's where the heritage lies. You see, Abraham's spiritual descendants are blessed through the righteousness of faith. But as Paul goes on, he points out that the law is insufficient to bring favor and blessing from God. He says that very, very clearly. He says this in verse 14, "For if they which are of the law be heirs, faith is made void." If the law and keeping it is what makes us an heir of God's blessings, an heir of God's promises, then our faith, it's pointless, it's void, it's empty, and the promise made of none effect. Because the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. The idea that Paul is talking about here is he's pointing out the purpose of the law. The law here, and Paul's going to discuss this later, the law is not sin in and of itself, but the law has a distinct purpose in Paul's mind and in Paul's writings. The law never was intentioned in any way to bring us to righteousness. Instead, it was to show us our sinfulness. And in fact, Paul later on in another part of Romans, he actually very explicitly talks about how the law actually creates a sinfulness in us. It has this cyclical aspect to it, to where when we see the reality of the law, it creates a greater condemnation inside of us, because that's what the law's purpose is. It's to convince us of the reality of our sin, right? And where on the flip side, faith is the opposite of that. Faith is saying God has already completed the righteousness that is on my behalf. So if we are trusting in the law to make us an heir, then our faith is void. This is an important thing for us to understand as Christians because this is a constant conflict in our lives, is it not? We as Christians, I mean, maybe you're not like this. I know I am. I'm constantly battling this mindset where I think that somehow, even as a Christian, because that's who Paul's talking to here, where somehow as a Christian it has some sort of connection with my works that I have any kind of righteousness or any kind of inheritance of God's blessings. I really appreciated last week when Brother John connected us from the idea of God's blessings back to the Beatitudes. And it actually was something I had never considered before. I've preached on and talked about God's blessings, and I'll often discuss how God's blessings are not physical as a part of this world. God's blessings are not temporal or something that we look for here. God's blessings are rooted in He Himself. He is our blessing, and His nature and His kingdom are where that is all contained. And what Brother John did for us last week is he showed us the Beatitudes. I've always focused on the front half of the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they that mourn. Blessed are the meek, right? Blessed are the persecuted. Whereas he showed us that the second half is where we see God's blessings. For they shall inherit the earth. For they shall obtain mercy. For they shall be filled. For they shall see God. And I realized in that moment, wow, God actually does explicitly highlight the blessings that He desires to give us. God wants to give us spiritual blessings in our lives. But what leads us to those blessings is not a work of our own hands. You and I cannot, in our own effort, ever get ourselves any closer to God's blessings. Because Paul says here, it's faith, not law. It's faith, not works. God's desire for you and me is that we would receive those blessings. They are His promise. His heart towards us is to give us blessings. It's good for us to want those things because it's what God desires for us in our lives. But it is not good for us to mistakenly think that somehow any work of my own hands or volition can get me closer to that blessing. There is no righteousness nor holiness that I can attain in my own life. Because if there was a smidgen of righteousness or holiness that I could attain by any work that I do, Paul says very clearly, then faith is void. Faith is made of none effect. Because the law, it works wrath. The law only brings condemnation. The law only points out our sinfulness. But faith leads us to the righteousness of Jesus Christ. Douglas Moo, again in his commentary, he writes this: if faith is to secure God's promised blessing, it cannot have anything to do with the law. For the law demands works, and human beings are forever unable to produce sufficient works to gain God's favor. A little later, Moo writes this: when Paul says, then where there is no law, there is no transgression, he was reminding us of the very nature of law. It sets out in considerable detail the demands of God for His people. No one can claim ignorance or uncertainty about God's requirements once the law is promulgated or given to us. Failure to obey those commands is therefore a more serious matter, even than our failure to follow the will of God expressed in the conscience of people and in the natural law, as we saw in Romans chapter 1 and 2. If you remember back to the beginning of our study in Romans, we talked quite extensively about the fact that the truth about God is distinctly displayed for us in creation and in our conscience, that God has put something in the world for us to see and point back to Him, that there is one true God, but God has also put something inside of us as human beings that tells us of our distinct need for a relationship with our God. But more than that general revelation, when God has looked at His people and said, thus saith the Lord, here are my rules, here are my regulations, here are the stipulations that you must follow, there is a greater condemnation that follows that indication of God's will and God's desire for us. And what Paul is pointing out here is that condemnation and that requirement is far too great for you or I to keep in any way, shape, or form of our own volition. The law will always require works, and whenever we rely on works, we always, as human beings, find ourselves in failure. So it's because the promises come by faith and not law that it can be guaranteed to all of Abraham's descendants. You see, this is the fairness of God. This is the justness of God. God says, all have sinned. All have fallen short of my glory. It's funny for us to compare ourselves among ourselves as sinners. I mean, the irony that we, who claim to have realized the depths of our depravity and our desperate need for a Savior because of the great gulf that is fixed between us and our God because of our sin, it is kind of ironic or almost downright humorous for us to compare ourselves and our sinfulness amongst ourselves, for us to look around and point out, well, they're so much bigger of a sinner than I am. Oh, man, they got bigger problems. I mean, kind of silly to think about it, don't you think? And what Paul here is pointing out is that what God has done by making it by faith and not by laws, he has leveled the playing field for us all. In verse number 16, he says this, therefore it is of faith that it might be by grace, to the end that the promise might be sure to all the seed, not to that only which is of the law, but to that also which is of the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. It's because this promise comes by faith and not law that it can be guaranteed to Abraham's descendants, all of his descendants, including us. In verse number 17, we see how the promise of God plays out in this spiritual way. According to Paul, Abraham would be the father of many nations, including ones that did not yet exist, including this nation that did not yet exist, the people of God, the people of the church. In verse 17, as it is written, going back to the Old Testament here, I have made thee a father of many nations, God talking to Abraham. Paul goes on to say, before him whom he believed, even God, who quickeneth the dead, and calleth those things which be not as though they were. Calling those things which be not as though they were. That statement, quickeneth the dead, does that ring an idea in your head who might be being talked about here? That's the people of God. There is one nation who was dead and has been made alive by our God, and that is Christians, right? That is us who have been saved. We have been made alive by the power of the Holy Spirit, by the resurrection of Jesus Christ on our behalf. And God, no doubt, was referring specifically when he made that promise to Abraham to the Jewish nation. Without question, that promise finds at least partial fulfillment in the Jewish people. But Paul here is distinctly saying as well that it finds its promise in how Abraham's faith leads him to be the father of us all who are saved by faith, who are connected with God by faith and not law, and how God has made a nation out of Abraham's descendants of us, those who are the saved by faith. You see, it's faith, not law. It's not just about the Jewish people who receive the law. It's about all those who have trusted in God by faith alone. But not only is it faith, not law, but we also see that it's faith, not sight. Paul's going to continue on with using Abraham as an illustration here. Starting in verse 18, he says this, who against hope believed in hope, that he might become the father of many nations, according to that which was spoken, so shall thy seed be. And being not weak in faith, he considered not his own body now dead, when he was about 100 years old, neither yet the deadness of Sarah's womb. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God. And being fully persuaded that what he had promised, he was able also to perform, and therefore it was imputed to him for righteousness. Now it was not written for his sake alone that it was imputed to him, but for us also, to whom it shall be imputed if we believe on him that raised up Jesus our Lord from the dead, who was delivered for our offenses and was raised again for our justification. You see, Abraham trusted God in a humanly impossible situation. In verse 18 through 21, we see that story about Abraham who received the promise of a child. And the Bible describes us in vivid detail that it was clearly an impossible situation. I mean, Abraham was 100 years old. Sarah, her womb was dead, is what the Bible describes here. But yet they, against hope, believed in hope that he might become the father of many nations, as we see in verse 18. You see, this faith is why Abraham was credited with righteousness, according to Paul, verse 22. And therefore, because of this faith, because of this hope against all hope, hope in an impossible situation, because of this, it was imputed to him for righteousness. See, Paul is not claiming that Abraham's faith was perfect or that he never had any doubts whatsoever. Rather, his point is that Abraham, despite some very human doubts, always came back in the end to faith in the promise of God. He, therefore, is an outstanding biblical example of a person who walked by faith rather than by sight. This encourages me, because if you've read the story of Abraham, it doesn't really line up with what Paul describes here, does it? I mean, Paul, if you only go based on what Paul's description here is, it would seem that Abraham was this stalwart, strong in the faith man who never one time wavered or doubted. And boy, is that the furthest thing from the truth if you go back to Genesis and read Abraham's story. Oh man, Abraham and Sarah, they made a mess out of it, didn't they? Because of their doubts in the promises of God, because they weren't sure that God was really able to fulfill what he had promised. But yet, the Bible upholds Abraham as this shining example of faith. Have you ever been in a situation like Abraham? A situation where you know God has called you to faith. You know that God has promised that he can carry you through whatever situation you face in your life. You know that it's going to be hard. You know that you're going to be weak at moments, but you know I've got to have faith in God, but yet it just seems impossible. In fact, it is impossible, humanly speaking. But that's the crux of faith, isn't it? Faith is not simply belief in the face of doubt. That's not the idea there. I love how Douglas Moo described it in his commentary. That's why I used that quote. It's how Abraham consistently came back to that faith even through his own failures. Because if the crux of Abraham's faith was about how strong he held it, well, we're back to the works thing again, aren't we? Because your faith and my faith is not determined by how strong we hold our faith, but by how faithful our God is. Because Abraham, in the end of the story, he had to time and again come back to the promise of God, not his own ability to try to fix what he thought God was unable to do. My friends, this is the story of our Christian life, isn't it? God has promised that he has made a way for our salvation, that he has paid our price once and for all. But yet how often do we as Christians somehow try to make up our perceived gap in what God left unfulfilled by performing in our own attempts of righteousness to create righteousness and holiness of our own? When we are faced with those humanly impossible situations where we struggle and we wrestle and we doubt and we find ourselves making a mess of it just like Abraham and Sarah did. I'm so encouraged when I read through the New Testament and I see the story of Jesus who interacted with a man who came and made an impossible request of Jesus, and Jesus' response was to him, he said, "If thou wilt believe, this can be done." And the man made such an amazing response that I identify with so often in my life. He said, "Lord, I believe, but help thou my unbelief." And that man acknowledged in that very distinctly human moment, God, I believe, I really do, and I want to believe, and I want to continue living in that belief, but God, I'm just going to be honest. There are doubts here. There are struggles here. I'm not always sure the answer to this is. And Lord, as many times as I've heard the stories of you healing and of you providing and of you doing miraculous works, God, Jesus, I believe in you. But there's still that doubt I'm struggling with. And in that moment, what does Jesus do? He fulfills the request for healing in the face of that man's doubt. Because it wasn't about that man's doubt or strong faith. It was about the power of Jesus Christ to fulfill what only he can do. And in Abraham's situation, the Apostle Paul holds him up as this shining example of faith, despite the fact that Abraham doubted, that Abraham messed up that situation, that Abraham created quite the situation for his descendants as a result of his doubt in God. But you know what? Just like Abraham received righteousness by this kind of faith, we too can have righteousness credited to our account by believing on him that raised up Jesus our Lord from the dead. Verse 23 and 24, Paul is so clear about this. He says, "Now it was not written for his sake alone, Abraham's sake alone, that it was imputed to him, but for us also, to whom it shall be imputed." That word imputed means for something to be put on the account of someone else. The idea of imputing would be if I were to go down and I knew about a debt that you had and I were to go down and I would have put money on that debt, I would be imputing payment on your debt, right? So that's the idea here where he says that now it was not written for his sake alone that it was imputed unto him, but for us also, to whom it shall be imputed if we believe on him that raised up Jesus our Lord from the dead. Again, Paul emphasizing the power of God in that moment. You see, in chapter 4, Paul presented several irrefutable reasons why justification is by faith. It's by faith because it is a gift. It cannot be earned by works, as we saw in verses 1 through 8. The second one is, since Abraham was justified before he was circumcised, circumcision has no relationship to that justification. That's what we saw Brother John share last week in 9 through 12. We talked about this today. Number 3, since Abraham was justified centuries before the law, justification is not based on the law, verses 13 through 17. And finally, Abraham was justified because of his faith in God, not because of his works, verses 18 through 25. That's from John Whitmer in Romans in the Bible Knowledge Commentary. But he's pointing out the fact that Paul has systematically gone through and shown us that justification in our lives can only be by faith. And he uses the example of Abraham, this shining, stalwart person in the minds of the Jewish believers, to point out that his justification was by faith alone, not by his connection to the law, not because he was the father of the Jews, but because he had faith in God. And that's what leads us back into Romans chapter 5, verse 1. Therefore, because we have been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Not because we have been justified by faith and we changed our lives. Not because we have been justified by faith and have become faithful in church attendance. Not because we've been justified by faith and anything else. Paul's only criterion here is because we've been justified by faith, we have peace with God. That is our position as Christians always and forever, because it's based on our faith in the work of Jesus Christ that has been finished. Nothing that you or I did got us to that position, and nothing you or I can do can remove us from that position. Your position before God is at peace with him. That's where Paul has led us through Romans chapter 4. So as we pull it to a close this evening, I want to come back to those questions. Paul makes quite the argument throughout the chapter in Romans, and I know I didn't go all the way back through the beginning of the chapter like to what Brother John talked about last week, but this first question really dips into that. According to Paul's argument in Romans, why is keeping the law never sufficient to provide us righteousness or God's blessings? The second question, and I hope that you'll take the discussion aspect of these next two seriously. In what areas of your life do you feel that struggle between faith and sight? Just like Abraham did, right? Share an example of where you trusted God in a situation that seemed humanly impossible and how it affected your faith. And just like Abraham, you can share an example of how you trusted God, then didn't trust God, then trusted God, then tried to take it in your own hands, then trusted God again, right? That's the reality of our walk with God, and that's okay. God is faithful even through our struggles and our doubts. Praise God for that. And then that third question, like Abraham, we all have moments of doubt. Every single one of us. Are there doubts that you're currently wrestling with that you feel comfortable sharing? How can we as a church family support each other during these times of doubt? I can't remember what the statistic was. I read this a while back. A survey had been done amongst churchgoers, and they asked a representative sample of church attendees, people who regularly attended church. They asked them to rate their level of doubt in the Christian message. And I was astounded by the responses that I was reading in this survey. And they had a variety of different questions, but essentially they were showing that a decently large percentage of people who attend church on a regular basis aren't even sure they truly believe the truths that are presented in the Christian message. My friend, it's not lost on me that even within this room, there might be people who deep down, if you're being honest with yourself, you're not sure if you truly believe these things. You're not sure if you feel like you can actually trust in God. Please don't misunderstand the statement. That's okay. Because God is faithful, and his desire is to prove your doubts. God isn't scared by your doubts. Neither am I. Okay? God wants to prove them. And if you're here today and you're struggling with some of these things that we're talking about, if there are some areas where you feel like, man, I should have faith, but I just don't. I don't see how God can actually fulfill this. I don't see how God can show up for me in this situation. Don't be afraid of that. Share it. Let those of us in this church community, and this what's supposed to be a family, accompany you through that journey where God desires to prove himself in your life. Because even when we lack faith, our God is faithful. Remember, I'll give one last illustration. We'll be done for tonight. Remember when the disciples said to Jesus, Lord, increase our faith. Remember what he responded with? If you had faith but as a mustard seed, you could say to this mountain, be removed hence, and it would be cast into the depths of the sea. What's interesting about that? The disciples said, Lord, make our faith bigger. And Jesus' immediate response is de-emphasizing the size of faith. Because he says it's not about how big your faith is. Because it's not dependent on you. It's dependent on the one you have faith in. If you have a struggle with faith today, it's okay. So did Abraham. Come back to God. He'll prove it. He'll prove it to you because he is faithful.